Well, good afternoon and welcome to the first of 3 lectures during this year's celebration. This lecture is entitled Documenting Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian Jewelers, 1850 to the Present. Going to be presented by Zachary Jones. The presentation shares information about historic Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian jewelers, including photographs of the artists and their works. And his objective here, one of the objectives, is to engage the community in outreach and further discussion to document and identify additional artists. This is actually Zach's dissertation. He's, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Zach Jones, but he's been our archivist. He was up until about 2 years ago. For 7 years, he was our archivist and collections manager and kind of exhibit designer and all-around kind of person dealing with our archives and photograph and sound collections and objects. And he's a historian by training and worked as a curator in Virginia and here, and currently works for the State Division of Libraries, Archives, and Museums, and teaches evening classes at UAS. Like I said, he's a PhD candidate at UAF in interdisciplinary studies. And welcome, Zach, and look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Well, thank you all very much and welcome. It's wonderful to be here and humbling to stand before you. And it always feels good to be at Sealaska. Such wonderful people, such good friends. It's, as Chuck mentioned, I used to work here, but it feels like a home when I'm able to come back. But as Chuck mentioned, I'm here to talk a little bit about jewelers. But before I start, of course, I'd want to just make a few acknowledgments and thanks. Acknowledge that we're on Occoquan land today, and that we're here working on their land. And certainly thank Chuck and the various staff of Sealaska Heritage Institute and the volunteers at Celebration 2016. It takes a lot to make Celebration happen. Having done it, and I'm really grateful for all their service and the things they've done for us. And to thank a handful of folks who've helped me learn. This includes, here I'm speaking of some museum workers. Jackie Hamburg, I'd really like to acknowledge at the Sheldon Jackson Museum, and Lyanna Wallace and Andrew Washburn at the Alaska State Museum, and Andrea Nelson at the Sheldon Museum in Haines have really helped out. But I especially want to thank my good friend Donald Gregory. He works here at Sealaska. He's a friend, absolutely. He's also a very good artist and a very good art historian, and I think he's been a real great help to me. Even though I feel like a learner, I've always found the more we try to study things, sometimes the more questions come up. But maybe to kind of give an overview and sort of lay out some objectives of what I'm going to talk about today. Sort of one of my research objectives, as Chuck mentioned, is to share some information and to work with folks who are interested in talking about this subject, and then to really identify and document and acknowledge some of these jewelers. This can be historic jewelers, but also jewelers who are working today. But for my presentation today, I kind of went back and forth on how can I talk about so many good people in such limited time. So I would have to apologize if I don't cover someone that you were hoping to hear about. I have a booth over at Centennial Hall, and I'd love to keep talking with folks and learning too. But today, for this presentation, I'm primarily going to introduce historic artists and primarily talk about Tlingit artists today in this presentation, though I'm certainly working to document Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian jewelers. And kind of my thought about this presentation and going along with it, I kind of figured I thought, how will I do this and keep folks? So I figured I'd kind of bring you along on this little bit of an investigation with me, and maybe kind of show how I've been going about trying to learn these things. Share some of the evidence and things I've learned. So it's kind of you're coming along with me, as it were. So hopefully that works. for folks. But I guess in some ways this idea of documenting jewelers started a number of years ago. I work here at Sealaska as a curator, and sometimes folks would walk in and they'd walk up and hold their wrist out and be like, "Can you tell me who made this bracelet?" You know, my auntie or my grandma or whatever the story is gave it to me. And sometimes that was a lot of pressure. And I often had to say, you know, I'm not certain. And so there's a thing right there. How do you really identify some of these historic jewelers? They didn't sign their works if we go back far enough. And there's not really a publication or guide, at least for Tlingit researchers, for Tlingit jewelers to find this information out. So the question is how do you go about this? And at least this is how I've been doing some of it. Kind of 4 at least steps, and I think these kind of sometimes overlap. But one is I've tried to study every historic piece of jewelry in a museum and ask, do you know who made this piece? So ask every museum out there. That's one step. And the other is then talk to people and see. Because sometimes folks might say, yeah, I know, yeah, my grandma got this when she graduated from, you know, school, and it was, you know, dad bought it or grandpa bought it from so-and-so. So to talk to folks and get that kind of an information. And I have a booth in Centennial Hall during celebration to talk with folks about it. And if people are watching this in the future, because they're going to put it online, you can certainly contact me. I'd love to talk with you. And then sort of the third thing is really study every piece of jewelry I can lay my eyes upon. And also understand the processes and how silversmiths made these things over time. How did they make a piece of jewelry 150 years ago? What did that look like? And then also look real closely at their style. And then the fourth is really try to understand the lives of jewelers. That's really my big focus, is learn about people and acknowledge people. There's been a lot of books, you could say, where people have talked about style and what it looks like, but not who the jewelers themselves were. And that's what I'm really interested in, is learning about them, talking about them, and I think really acknowledging them. I've found of the jewelers I've been able to identify and dig into their lives, these folks were really good people. They were leaders, they were servants in their community. Men and women have been jewelers historically. So to start out on my little search, to take you along on my research journey, I started a number of years ago. I began researching Jim Jacobs from Sitka. And I got into this at the urging of Ishmael Hope, who I'd like to acknowledge. And he wanted me to speak on Jim Jacobs at a clan conference a few years ago. And I have to acknowledge Ishmael and Harold Jacobs for helping me learn about him. So I started out on this journey. Who was Jim Jacobs? So I began digging and listening. He was, I've kind of listed some information here, but he was born around 1846 and he passed away in 1941. He lived in Sitka most of his whole life. He was Koskedi, Chashit, and he had 2 Tlingit names, Yiknawu, which means dead raven, and Kitchgak. Although he lived in Sitka, he had a lot of family ties and family relations from Yakutat and Dry Bay, and especially Luknahari folks. There's a closeness between him and his clan and them. He married Anna Jacobs, who was a Kagwantan woman, and they were married for, my understanding, a long time. And so when I've asked people about him, the stories that people tell, and these are a couple pictures of him, one standing with the Chashit tunic, and this is him in his jewelry shop working in Sitka. People remembered him really as being this really nice, kind person. He loved his children. Unfortunately, some of them died young, and people recall really his sadness and grief over losing his children because he had such a kind heart. But he loved to teach young children. He would even go to Sheldon Jackson. And there's evidence that he was a clan or clan house leader for the Koskedi. Of course, he was a real fantastic carver, a painter. He produced items of clan hats, but also a prolific jeweler. I'm just going to talk about his jewelry mostly today. Some folks knew him as Jim the Jeweler or Silver Jim. So these are some things I've been able to learn about him. Now, the thing was then is find pieces by Jim Jacobs. I started that thing of asking around and looking in museums. There's not too many pieces of a certain genre. This was the first piece I encountered, this big spoon that he did. You can kind of see in proportion to the smaller bracelet, not by him, but this thing is a big thing, and it was wrapped with some silver. And so I took a look at that and started looking really closely at it and its style. Got to zoom up close, and you can sort of see some things. The way he did his eyes, he often did 3 little hash marks on the cheek, and sometimes some little hash marks on the chin or underside of a beak or a jaw. And that's one thing in the shape of his eyes. And this is at the State Museum, so I found this first. And I kept looking everywhere I could, and what I found was there's a lot of spoons by him. In the late 1800s, turn of the century, there was a bit of a spoon craze. People, especially tourists that would come on the cruise ship, loved to buy his spoons. And there's probably around 30 or so spoons in museums around the world that I've been able to find. As far as bracelets that are attributed to him, the Sheldon Jackson Museum has 3 bracelets by him. Well, 4. We've since identified a 4th. Of those 3 that we initially found, 2 were bangles identical to this one bracelet you can see here, and one was a floral design. So I started looking at these, and really with a lot of these, there's a real good pattern. You can see he often did a double line around the back of the head, and then did some work here, and he did that with a lot of his pieces. He's got his cheek hash marks, his hash marks under the jaw. So those are some of the things that kind of stood out, that was pretty distinct to him from all the other bracelets, all the other artists I'd look at. So I looked at every museum I could find, and no one had like a big flat bracelet with form line on it by him that was attributed to him. So I had to keep digging and looking around. And so there's that question, as going about this, how do you make a jump from looking at an artist's spoons or a smaller bangle bracelet to a bigger, more large form line bracelet? No museum held one that was attributed. So how do you do that? Well, I had kind of used style and looked at enough of his other pieces. I was able to find one, the only one I've been able to find in a museum. And you can kind of see this piece. This is at the Sheldon Jackson piece, a real great piece. It has this classic double line that I've never seen any other artist do, and some of the other signature features that are his. He was really well known and revered as a real great jeweler during his time. So that's kind of one way I've went about it, of trying to find pieces by him and some other artists. Sometimes have to make that jump from just spoons, because museums only were able to document the spoons. And of course, I'm talking to folks. So now it's time for a little disclaimer. A lot of folks these days are trying to look at style. And I think there's some real merits to that. But you also have to, I think, be careful. I could show you these 2 bracelets here, and if I looked at them cold, I'd say the styles on these are very different, maybe different artists. But these are by the same artist at just different points in their life. Sometimes an artist might have just been working to churn something out for tourists. They did it quick. Sometimes maybe he made something for a family member, and they put some real time into it. Sometimes they were young. Sometimes they changed their styles over time. So these are by the same artist, Amos Wallace, a real great silversmith. So we have to be careful with style, and I've tried to be real cognizant of that. So what I'm kind of doing with my research is, as I say, work to turn unknowns into knowns if I can. Museums don't tell or document everything, and in most cases, most museums do not have hardly any items that are attributed to the artist. the collectors weren't interested in that thing, and I think it's important to acknowledge folks. So what I'm doing here and at my booth at Celebration and elsewhere is talking with folks and hoping to have folks come forward with those stories of, here's my bracelet, and I got it from my grandmother, and she said that, they bought it from Rudolph Walton, and try to put things and break that I guess, through that wall, and be able to document these folks and attribute some of their works.
What is that bracelet made out of?
This is copper with abalone inlays, a very old bracelet. Beautiful piece. I don't know for sure who made that one, but it's attributed as a Tlingit bracelet. So I'm going to talk now about a few more people that are from Sitka, and then conclude with a few non-Sitka artists. Wanted to mention and a lot of these folks that I'm going to talk about were contemporaries. They worked alongside. As George Emmons said when he was in Sitka, he thought there were 4 silversmiths working in Sitka around this time, and I've been able to figure out who those 4. He listed Jim, as by Jim, but Jim Jacobs, and then who he said Rudolph, but this was Rudolph Walton. He was Kiksadi. He had 2 Tlingit names. I somehow left one off, but Kawatuk and Aktatsin were his Tlingit names. In 1885, he married Daisy Jackson, and they were married for a time, but unfortunately she passed away, and he married Mary Charles. And I think his story is kind of an interesting story. He started out in life, he attended Sheldon Jackson, and then when he finished, he got a job at a nearby mine. Now, working at the mine at this time was not a very healthy environment, and it was a little bit dangerous, and the pay was not great. He did not love that, as folks and families said. So he worked for the mine for a while, but then he quit. And he came back to Sitka and worked as an artist for the rest of his life. He came back in that first month, he started selling his pieces, and he made more money in a month than he did in like 6 months working at the mine. And he didn't have to live away from his family either. He had to live at the mine. He wanted to be by his family, and he made decent money. And he had a shop. This is kind of a picture of his house. He had a sign out front that said Rudolph Walton, maker of native jewelry. These are a couple pictures of him. One is he's in his A&B. He's got his Alaska Native Brotherhood sash on, or Kugena, and he served a lot of years with A&B and really fought for land rights and a lot of things that were important to the community at the time. Folks today benefit from his work and service. So of course he had his little jewelry, his house, and he had these big bay windows that tourists could come up and take a look, and he produced a whole bunch of stuff for them. And he's remembered as being A.P. Johnson's teacher, if that's of interest to folks. Now you'll see, I've looked around at a lot of museums, and there's a handful of pieces around by Walton, not as many silver pieces, but he produced a lot of stuff. These are a couple, a bowl at the State Museum, which is on exhibit, and some at the Burke Museum here. And I kind of think it's important to also look at the way they did their form line on wood too, if you're trying to spot their bracelets on silver, gold, or copper. Now, he was also someone that spoke to George Emmons, who was, you could kind of say, an anthropologist or collector of the day. And Emmons passed him his journal one time, and Rudolph made these form line sketches for Emmons that are now in the Emmons Tlingit Indians book. So you can kind of take a look at some of his stuff that he did, which I think is kind of helpful in spotting things. And so as far as Walton and his silver work, he was a real big producer, maybe the biggest producer of silver spoons. You can kind of see some examples, and a lot of folks, they turn up in museums a fair amount, and a lot of people have them, collectors have them. And folks have been able to kind of identify his style, but there's another method too of kind of figuring out of spotting a Walton piece. And if you can see on this spoon here, he wrote Sitka in cursive. And folks have kind of been able to document his style by his handwriting. He wrote Sitka kind of unlike anyone else. And so that's been kind of one of his signature tells, as it were. So this is one piece that turned up. And maybe I'm kind of always looking for a big form line flat bracelet. This is a small napkin ring. It's kind of blown up big here. This is at the Sheldon Jackson Museum. And it has that telltale signature of Sitka on the inside of it. Has some deer and a little bit of other things going on here. But this is one of the very few pieces known by Walton that's beyond a spoon. Now there are some other pieces that he did that have some silver wrapped around them. This is a big piece that's carved, and it's at the Hood Museum at Dartmouth. Fairly tall piece, but at the top and bottom he capped it with silver. And as you can kind of see on the end picture here, if you can't see it, he signed it and dated it. He did sign some of his pieces, but he dated it 1897 and signed it in his signature way of writing Sitka. There is even one piece at the Sheldon Jackson Museum where he signed it with his name, which was unusual, but he wrote Aktatsin, his Tlingit name, on a piece. So a fairly unusual thing. Now the other thing, I went and I asked and looked around at every museum, what bracelets are attributed to Rudolph Walton? There were 3 at the Sheldon Jackson Museum, but we've been talking about them, and 2 of them I didn't agree, and we kind of found that they probably were not by Walton. But this is, my understanding, the only bracelet attributed to Rudolph Walton in any museum. And this is kind of a bangle style, which makes it a little hard to spot a flat bracelet. And the attribution for this, and that's something I always ask the museum, how do you know what you know? This was donated by Ellen Hope Hayes, and said she had obtained it through the family and that Walton had made it. And she donated it to the museum a number of years ago before her passing. Another great person there. So then how do we find bracelets by Walton? And I don't know if I've found any yet. I'm trying to be on the trail and I'm hoping to learn, but there's one other clue. The Alaska State Museum, it's on loan by the family, but Walton had a snuff box. And this is the pictures of the front and the back with a raven and a frog. Even has his initials, and it's dated 1918. Now it's kind of thought and that it was his personal piece, but I've kind of wondered, did he make it or was it a gift?
He made it.
He made it. Okay. I heard he made it. So, and that's kind of what I've heard, and I think that's good. And you're his granddaughter, and you'd.
My sister.
Okay. Well, we should chat. I'd love to learn more. We put you right on the spot there. I don't mean it, but I really admire Walton. What a super person. You know, I'm talking about some of their jewelry and stuff, but the things I love are the stories that people tell. You know what so-and-so was like as a person or as a father or grandfather. I think those are the beautiful stories. Sometimes there's some good jokes and funny stories. Those are the kind of things we remember about our family. But this is one piece, and I've tried to look at it with some of the stuff he drew for Emmons, and it does look pretty darn close. And I think when the family would know. So, and I think I like that. So I'm glad to see that, and glad to see the family here, and appreciate their kindness. So, but that's some things about Rudolph Walton. Now, as I mentioned, Emmons said there were 4 smiths in Sitka. The other one that was known, and he worked maybe a little bit before, but certainly during Walton and Jacobs, was a person known as a Sitka Jack. He passed away in 1916. He was a little older than these folks. Maybe he even, I sometimes wonder if maybe he taught some of them. And there's some evidence that he may have taught some. Some of his stuff, even Jim Jacobs looks like his, but I can't say for certain. But he was Luknahati Yehit, and he was a Kagwantan Yadi, or child of the Kagwantan. He married a woman named Martha. She was Kagwantan. she was Eagle Nest House, and they had 13 daughters. And so as people sometimes say, that's why there's so many Eagle Nest House people, because they had 13 daughters together. So, but there's a lot of stories and evidence that come down that say, yeah, he was a leader of the whale house. And there's stories, just to share one, that about in 1877 when he and his clan gave a big kuik, there's a lot of remembrances of him giving away a lot of blankets, his clan giving away a lot of blankets and being to give and to share. And there's this picture of a little piece that reportedly he greeted everyone who attended this party with this whale figure. And certainly he's been documented as being a silversmith by tourists and folks that visited there, but also folks in the Tlingit community have remembered him. And I kind of figured I'd share one story, and I'll raise this later, but this is just one little account. Sometimes during the late 1800s, these folks that would travel the world, these were usually white folks and sometimes wealthy, they would write these little travel journals. And sometimes you do have to be, have to listen with an ear to the time. But this person, a woman, Skidmore, she came through in 1885 and stopped in Sitka, and she mentioned Sitka Jack and a fellow silversmith by name. But she wrote in her book in 1885 that Sitka Jack and Kuska, and I'm going to come back to that name, the silversmiths of the Sitka Kwan are very skillful workmen, and one can sit beside their workbenches and watch them fashion the bracelets that are in such demand. During the summer months, they can sell their ornaments faster than they can make them, and in 2 hours after a steamer's arrival, their stock is exhausted. And they work night and day on special orders while a vessel is in at the wharf. If you give them the order in the morning, the bracelets are ready in the afternoon, as carefully finished and engraved as any of the others of their make. And in one doorway, I think this is good to mention, we saw a woman crouching or lying face downwards, slowly engraving a silver finger ring. She had a broken penknife as an engraver's tool, and she held it close to her hand, blade down, and drew it towards her as she worked. So I think this is kind of an interesting little bit to hear someone's perspective. It does mention Sitka Jack, Kuska, and that there was a silversmith woman working there. I've yet to find her name. I've heard a few different things, but I think it's important to acknowledge that women have been jewelers too. So there's that little bit about him. So finding pieces by Sitka Jack. There's a group of collectors, and they feel that Sitka Jack's, they've identified some of Sitka Jack's works. For example, here, when George Emmons came through Sitka, he picked up, I think it was 13 spoons, and then he sold them to the American Museum of Natural History. And the records on this, Emmons wrote in their ledger that all of these spoons were made by the same smith, and he talked about the process of how the person made it, melted and pounded the silver. A lot of these folks used silver dollars or gold dollars, depending on what they were working with to make it. And so there's these type of spoons, and that's the only pieces that are really attributed to him. And it's been done by them. And one way they say you've been able to, they spotted it was by his signature of the word Sitka, another handwriting situation. So there's those type of spoons. I'll zoom in. Just that mention that Emmons wrote they were all by the same artist. There was also a pin, this pin that was collected reportedly by Sitka Jack. So the challenge then is look real close at these tiny spoons, and how do you make a jump from a spoon to a bracelet? I don't quite know if I can only guess at this point. So maybe, I think talking with folks, maybe someday we'll be able to crack the code, maybe not, because there's nothing in museums, and but I'm hoping to encounter folks who might be willing to talk. I've tried to do different things like look at how he did his eyes on his spoons and some bracelets collected in Sitka at the same time he was working. Sometimes I look at these two bracelets here and I wonder if they were by him. I don't know for certain. Sometimes you can just speculate, but I'm not certain. But that kind of brings me to another one of his contemporaries and co-workers and fellow clan member, Sitka Charlie. This is the fourth person that Emmons mentioned. Now, Sitka Charlie, he was Luknahari, same whale house as Sitka Jack, and this picture here, just right out, standing next to him is Sitka Jack. They were the same clan, they worked together, leaders, respective leaders, and had leadership roles in their own clan and clan house. And he's been remembered as a jeweler. He married a woman named Mary Jim and Kitty Milton during his life. And there's some stories about him in Frederica de Laguna's Under Mount St. Elias. The people that spoke to her remembered some things about him. Some good stories about him being a leader and at times, serving in certain roles. So really the only piece that's ever been attributed to him anywhere is this spoon that's in a private collection because he wrote his name on it. It's really unusual for folks in that time to have signed their name on anything. I mean, no one really did it. Walton wrote Octot Scene on the one piece, and this is the only one with Sitka Charlie. I wonder if maybe the person who bought it from him said, "Will you please sign it?" I don't know, but I guess. So, and this one's a little tougher to even match the form line of how he did it because it's not as easy. So the question then, how do we try to find out what stuff he did? Emmons said he was a producer. He worked there in Sitka, but there's nothing by him. As you've kind of caught drift, there's times we look at handwriting. So if you look in Sitka Charlie, I know he signed Charlie, and I'm going to say focus on the word Sitka here. Sometimes folks will look at handwriting. This handwriting is a little different in some ways to another artist's handwriting. Folks have been trying to figure it out, but there are some similarities. Folks say this is kind of like sans serif font, if we were to say font. But if you look, like the tip of his S has sort of this, it comes out with a little edge, and his T has it hangs down. And the way the K, if you can see that, joins not quite together, but a little bit up. Now there's an artist who was a prolific producer at Sitka. People have one person kind of joked and said, well, I call him the Wacky K artist because he did his Ks a special way. That's kind of just a fun pet name until they could figure out. And I don't quite have any hard evidence, and all I'm suggesting is I don't have any hard evidence, but I really wonder and maybe stepping back, but I really wonder if it's the artist we've been looking at. But as that one person who wrote in 1885, Sitka Jack and Koska, that sounds an awful lot like his Tlingit name. He was there, so again, that K. Here's some examples, and there are a lot of silver spoons that this guy, he signed nearly all of them with the word Sitka. And he wrote it kind of like this. It's not big like the other one, and he didn't kind of do an engrave, but he did it with this same kind of font, almost this sans serif, and did his K's kind of a funny way. This is the one, and I really wonder if it's the same artist. There's a lot of spoons by this artist, who may or may not be Sitka Charlie. And I think I've even found one bracelet based on the handwriting, and because of the handwriting, the way he turned the S a little bit, I'll back that up. He kind of sometimes turned the S a little bit that way. Not always, but sometimes. Just real fine little things. But he did that on this one that, somebody wanted it to read United States of America and have an anchor. This was probably a custom make for someone who came through. But a really, really good artist. And there's some form line that goes around this that does gel. I think it was the same artist that made those spoons that made this one. Now this artist also didn't just do silver, he even did wood pieces, and he signed them the same way. Here's a couple paddles. I know the picture's not super, but It's the exact same. This is in a private collection, and that one is in a museum of Vancouver. Same type of a little dance paddle about yay long, same handwriting. And I really wonder if it's by him. A very good artist, beautiful form line. And it'd be, so I'm kind of hoping maybe to someday verify if it is or it isn't. Maybe it isn't, but there's some evidence suggesting it's possible. So Sitka Charlie. Now, I'm moving forward here, kind of leaving Sitka to a couple more jewelers and then work towards a conclusion, just to share some styles and stories about a couple people. Next to mention Charlie Canook. His last name is kind of an adaptation of his Tlingit name, which often happens as Gunhuakt, which means gold eyes. And he was from Cake, and he was Suktanedi. Although he was in Cake, he kind of lived between Cake and Wrangell. He produced a lot of his bracelets in Wrangell, especially during the late 1800s, but at least by the year 1900 he was back in Cake. And I don't have a picture of him here, I apologize, but this is one kind of thing. I've looked at federal censuses, and this is the 1910 and 1900 census, lists his name as Charlie Canook, and he declared his profession in 1900 as being a silversmith, and this gels with the other folks. They declared their professions. And then in 1910, he said he was a native policeman and a silversmith, declaring his profession. He was married to a woman named Sally, and they had one daughter that I've been able to document, Maudie. Maybe I need to be corrected, but I don't believe. I think she unfortunately died young. So these are some things that he worked as a silversmith, as an artist by profession. He turned out a lot of materials, and he worked as a policeman. And back in Cake, he was Cake's first mayor in 1915, so he was kind of a public figure as well. So how to spot his stuff? At least the Sheldon Jackson Museum, a number of years ago, a person decided to make a donation. She was from Cake, and she came forward and she said, "I'd like to donate this museum. This was made by my grandfather, Charlie Canook." And this bracelet here, it's a silver bracelet, is the piece that she donated. And so since then, folks have felt these pieces are by him. And one signature tell, folks have kind of said it looks like a bird print, like a bird stepped there, a cute little bird's foot. And there's a handful of bracelets that do show up with that, and the styles really all match. These are just a couple of examples to see what he looks like. And I do see people, he produced a fair amount, and I see people wearing his bracelets from time to time. He's a little easier to spot, and I think it's really good. The only thing that's interesting is that's the only bracelet in any museum attributed to him, but there's no spoons. And I think for the sake of time, I'll skip this, but there was an account where a person mentioned seeing him, and I've kind of wondered if this spoon was by him, dated 1889 in Fort Wrangell, just based on how the eye was done. But that's just a guess. But maybe to move to the last person to talk about, and there's so many people to talk about, and I really feel bad not being able to speak and acknowledge a lot of these people, but to mention Dan Katz Eek. He was Dalkawadi of the Killer Whale Fin House of Klukwan. He passed away in 1960. And really with a lot of these people, and I think Dan's a great example of one of these good people that worked so hard for his community and gave back. He was a charter member of A&B. He served as president, vice president, treasurer, and did work with the town council. He was a clan house leader, and he's remembered for rebuilding his clan's house. He made also clan hats, various items of that serve and empower clans and people today. But he was also a prolific jeweler. I found a lot of bracelets by him in museums. I've never found one signed, but there's been good provenance where people bought it directly from him, and so there's a lot of pieces. And there's a lot of artists that worked in recent times, like Lincoln and Amos Wallace, that really said he was a big influence, and they really liked his work, and they learned from him. And I've even heard some stories that Leo Jacobs liked to kind of try to peek over his shoulder, and Dan was very kind to him and helped him maybe learn a bit. And I kind of like, there's some nice things. Dan posed for a number of pictures making jewelry. You can kind of see the jeweler's block here. I'm not exactly sure what this is. I think I know, but this piece he fashioned into an old stump. How he curved his bracelets. He's got a hammer and a piece he worked out, and then how he's bulged the eyes. So I think some nice pictures that showed his own process. And if you have time and want to look real close, there's some real interesting things that can be learned. But there's a lot of pieces by Daniel Katz Eek around. This is just one piece here. I see him a lot, and his style to me is pretty easy to spot. One thing, he often turned one figure sort of right side up. You can see this raven, and then on the side there's that figure that's faced up, and adjacent to that is a close-up of that. And he did that with most of his bracelets, not all, but most. And he had a very distinct style, and he produced a lot. There's probably maybe 15 or 20 bracelets in museums around the world attributed to him, and there's a handful that aren't, but clearly look to be done by him. And here's a couple more examples. One of an eagle, another raven piece at the State Museum and Sheldon Museum in Haines. And he produced a lot, and a lot of people seem to be wearing his stuff today. Probably here at Celebration, I'm sure. Now, maybe moving towards closing on Daniel Katz Eek. I mentioned he was this person that really gave back. A lot of these jewelers were sometimes leaders. Sometimes they were clan house leaders or clan leaders. They taught young people. This is Dan here with some folks in the community in Klukwan. His son next to him there, and taught them. And there's a lot of people today that talk and remember Daniel Katz Eek. A good person here, David Katz Eek, that lives in the community, speaks fairly highly of his grandfather. Very good man. So of course, those are some people, but I'm always looking to try to document other people. There's a lot of jewelers, like William Eucas here. Dick Ieknawu of Angoon and Killisnoo, who were jewelers. But even folks that, I'm not necessarily looking for just a really old thing, but it could be folks who've worked in the recent period or folks who are even, still alive. We've got Norman L. Jackson of Cake and Sue Folletti. Great jewelers, and especially I think, important to document and acknowledge that there have been women jewelers as well. So in closing, certainly if you've got jewelry you'd like to be examined or identified, not that I can always, but I'll certainly try, but I'm a learner too. But I'd love to talk about artists and hear stories about who these people were. Yes, I love their art and I appreciate it, but I'd like to learn about the people. I think that's what needs to be said, and to acknowledge them, both past and present. Thank you, and Ganesh Chish.
We have time for questions. If there are any questions for Zach.
I know that a lot of artists down in Navajo, they signed their work, or they didn't when they first started, but later they did. They call them hallmark. Did any of the artists sign later and establish hallmarks? Some of the later artists on the 1900s or earlier. Do you know about that?
I haven't seen too many people that sort of used a symbol, as it were, to just really encapsulate who they were. The one that does come kind of mind is Sue Folletti, and maybe you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but if you've seen her bracelets, and she's still alive here, but I heard the story that with her name being Sue, she ordered an S, a stamp, so she could just thump the S on the inside of her bracelet. But when it came, the manufacturer sent an inverted S, or when you stamped it, it was inverted. And so if you see sort of an inverted or backwards S, like a mirror image, that's hers. And I heard she got that, and at first she was like, oh, dang it. But then after a while, she's like, that actually works pretty good. So, but not too many signatures, and it doesn't seem like folks started signing until maybe the 60s or after, their names at least. Any other questions? All right, go, Katie.
Well, I just want to thank you for this paper. Having done some work on looking for these artists and how hard it is to put together the museum collections and the names, and you have really done so much work to bring out the people, right? What is their family history? Who were they? What was their role in the clan? And that is even harder than this original piece of the style and the attribution, and it's such an important part of the picture, so I just wanted to acknowledge that. It's a hard set of research to do with the minimal amount of collections, and the collectors didn't acknowledge that jewelry was an important art form when they were collecting, so it's great work. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie. And Katie is, if you don't know Katie Bunn-Marcuse, she's a fantastic art historian, and she's done a lot of work on Haida jewelers, and I think very highly of her work, and I encourage you to read it. And but yeah, if anything, I really like the, maybe I'm kind of a nerd for genealogy. When I find these jewelers, I do want to know about them, but I want to know who were their parents and who were their children, because that's all important and that all matters, and I'm really interested in that. So thank you. I'm a learner, but it's a fun thing to do. Question?
Hi. I'm English, but only by birth. My parents are from Europe. Just so you get some background there. I was wondering about the teaspoons. Why teaspoons? I mean, why were they carving it on teaspoons? It's a bit odd.
That's a good question. Yeah, why teaspoons? I don't know if I could say necessarily why people loved them, but it was a very common item around that time, at least for Northwest Coast artists. People love, there was the one piece I didn't get a chance to share, but the one person, she said there is a spoon craze. And all these consumers love to buy spoons from Native artists. And they'd come up here and they'd just snap them up as fast as they could get them and just clean them out day and night. So these jewelers worked dang hard to keep their stocks up.
And all over the U.S.
Yeah.
It was popular all over.
Yeah.
It's an odd thing to, not something you imagine something using.
I think it was just one of those collectibles that people appreciated or wanted to collect. I don't know if it was too functional, but maybe that's some ways how I like bracelets, because as I talk to folks, and most of you know, I could probably say, tell me about your bracelet that you've got on, and most people are going to have a story of, well, I'm a shark and it's a shark, or this was my mother's, or whatever. And there's a real, I think, a beautiful kind of relationship and thing going on. It means a lot to people. Thank you.
I've seen a lot of spoon display things in my grandparents' generation, and there were things from a world fair or a state. If you went traveling, it was a very common sort of souvenir, but a nice souvenir, and they were displayed, all of them. We've been all these places.
Sterling.
Thank you.
Sterling spoons.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Yes. Question?
As a connoisseur of American dining implements, we all have to have some interest. About the 1880s on, as Americans began to travel around the United States, spoon collecting was an easily portable item, and it also coincided with the Victorian habit of, when serving tea, each woman often received a teaspoon and a cup. The cup went home. The spoon belonged to the owner. And so everything was a little different, and you actually had whole collections of teacups, the way that we now have bracelets, saying, I got it here, or I got it from so-and-so. And the spoons were often served with the teacups as an indication of the status of the person who was actually serving. I've been to Niagara Falls, I've been to Tallahassee, I've been to the Northwest Coast.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. That's good. I like that. Okay, let's go here.
Any in the Portland Art Museum's collection yet? Any of the jewels? I know you reached out to me recently. I don't know if you've looked at the online.
I have looked at everything you've got that's online, And there's a couple I wonder about. You do have one that's attributed to Dan Katz Eek already. But I hesitate to say anything firm at this point. I did see a bracelet today that's by the same jeweler as the one that you have. So I'm thinking about it and working.
That one looks familiar to one of the ones that you showed, with the eagle face.
The one by Charlie Canook.
Yes.
I'll look and see. I'll have to go back through and look. But I've been working on that.
Are you coming down? That one is silver.
Oh, it's silver?
It is silver, even though the lighting was, this is not a very high resolution photo, I apologize, but
We have the old one that looks similar.
I'll have to take another close look. Thank you, Dina, appreciate it. And you're going to be missed at your place. I understand you've got some family things, and I appreciate that. But you are wonderful, and I know a lot of people love you for your work and the kindness you've given to people up here in Tlingit country. Thank you. Was there another question I saw over here?
What's Katie's last name? You said Judy.
Oh.
My last name is Bun Marcuse, and I'm the curator of Native Art at the Burke Museum at the University of Washington. But my dissertation is, there's a copy here in the Sealaska Library, right? So
Yeah.
it's available.
Yeah,
Copy the video card.
if folks didn't hear that, Katie Bun Marcuse, and she works at the Burke, and she's looked at Haida silversmiths and other things, and she does some really nice work. I encourage folks to read it. So, any other questions or comments? Or we'll call it a close. Thank you so much for your kindness. I wish you well.